5 Sports and YouTube. So, the SEC, yeah, they took a few beatings early in the tournament when they had teams go down. When you have 14 teams, you're going to have some teams lose, and most of the lower level of their standings, the teams like Oklahoma, Texas, among others, were the ones that got beat. They got knocked out. But look at them now. They have 7 teams among the Sweet 16. The ACC had 7. I believe 6 had 7 in 2016. They had like 6 or 7 teams that were actually in the tournament. So you put enough in it, you're going to have some get through. But that was a great win for Ole Miss. Unfortunately for Iowa State. So 7 of the Sweet 16 is from the SEC, and so they did eventually pull through and move into the next level. The Big Ten, remember, they started 10-0. That is not the case now, but they still have a nice chunk. And how about the Big 12 with Houston, Texas Tech, BYU, and late yesterday evening, Arizona into the Sweet 16. There are the logos and graphics of each of those teams. Craig, I think 4 out of 7. You'd like to have had more. Maybe you felt like Iowa State could also slide through. But no, Ole Miss was really good with Chris Beard. But 4 of 7, pretty good for the Big 12.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty good for the Big 12. It's also, let's take a look at the SEC and start there with the 7. I mean, that's the crazy part of this whole thing is 7 teams. And I just talked about the talk before the tournament and all of the love that the SEC was getting at the best basketball conference in America. And look, they still need to go crown the national champion, but when you got 7 out of the 16 opportunities, I think there's a pretty safe bet they're probably going to do that, especially with all of the high seeds that they have still standing. But, I mean, to get 7 into the 16 is pretty remarkable, pretty cool for them. A great year, no doubt about it. But, yeah, 4 for the Big 12 I think is something you're still very excited about. That's a quarter of the field. Yeah, you would have loved to have snuck in an Iowa State, but they just got outclassed. Baylor got completely obliterated by Duke. That wasn't
not
even
a surprise.
close.
Yeah.
So, you took a couple on the chin, but I think 4 is really good. I think Arizona had a really nice win at the end of last night that almost slipped away. It almost had 5 Big 10 teams and 3 Big 12 teams, but, they held on. And obviously, there's still some very good teams remaining. Texas Tech, Arizona, BYU with a great win, and they're really playing incredible ball right now, and obviously Houston. So that's a good little field. Big Ten's got 4. And then the ACC with just the 1, and it's Duke who beat the mess out of Baylor. But as I mentioned a few minutes ago, that's 4 conferences in the Sweet 16.
Yeah,
that's
one.
all the Power 4 conferences. That's not the MAC or the, somebody getting somebody in. That's 4 conferences clearly representing, and that's what goes back to my talking point from a few minutes ago, is like, is this the new norm now because of the way the money is flowing? But, yeah, an incredible year by the SEC, and you're still happy if you're Brett Yormark. I mean, you got 4 cracks at the title out of 16, 4 good teams. I think you're feeling great about that.
Well, I spoke with TCU AD Mike Buddy earlier today. We'll have that interview later in the show. He was sitting with Brett Yormark as TCU's women got into the Sweet 16, talking about how they were hoping they could get that one more. Houston and BYU had comfortable leads and kind of controlled their games. They had to hang on, Arizona, but they got through. And so a pretty darn good start. But I miss Cinderella. I got to tell you, that's probably the least I've ever watched the weekend into the round of 32.
I watched quite a bit, and it's disappointing that you don't get that. I mean, every single team up there is some level of bigger brand than Cinderella. I mean, like there's a bunch of champions up there. There's a bunch of people really well. There's people who played in the title game. It's just how it is. I'm not ready to get all frantic about this whole thing is ruined. But when they throw 76 teams in here, it's gonna ruin it. It's gonna make it worse. And this week was kind of an indicator of what 76 would be if you leave it where it is. I think this thing will still be cyclical, but when you have gigantic, huge conferences that are 16, 18, 17 teams, yeah, you're going to see more teams of one conference in there because those are the teams that were going anyway a lot of the time. I mean, Texas was the last team in the SEC, but they were constantly at least making the tournament in the Big 12. So nothing's going to change except the conference patch on their chest. So, that doesn't, does that mean the SEC is great at basketball all of a sudden, or they just pick up some better brands?
They're having a hell of a year.
They're having a great year, yeah.
And they were able to. It could have been 5-9 or whatever got in, but they're having one heck of a year.
Well,
think about this.
Let's face
the
this,
Big
though.
12 is 10-3, Big 10 12-4, SEC is 15-7. That's pretty damn good.
Yeah, so, think about it this way. They added 2 teams, though. They added only 2 teams.
Yeah.
The Big 10 added 4 teams. The ACC added a couple of teams. The Big 12's obviously added a bunch of teams they had to backfill. But, yeah, there's been some extra teams added. But you're looking at the Pac-12 getting picked apart certainly in this. But, yeah, I think that all plays into it. But I think more of my concern is not so much the way the teams have been hoarded, although that's very evident in these totals. That's why all of a sudden the last year it's these are the most that has happened here. This is the most that's ever happened. Well, yeah, because everybody's got these super conferences now, to your point. But I think the money and the way that's flowing is the biggest issue here. Or not issue, but the biggest reason as to why, outside of the obvious of now the Big Ten gets to count Oregon as a tournament team and they get to count UCLA or whoever else. That's definitely contributing, but I do think the SEC only added 2 teams. So why are they suddenly having 14 teams in the tournament? Yeah. It's not because they added Texas and Oklahoma that 12 others are suddenly good enough to be in there as well. It's the commitment of money and the overrun of money that they have, where there's only so much you can spend on football after a while, and you've got so much left over. Where does that go? Well, that's going to basketball right now. Look at the coaching hires. We're going to get into those. That's why this is the way that it is as much as anything, I think, is because of the resources. And obviously, yes, the teams have added. But in the SEC's case, you only added 2.
Yeah. That
doesn't make a huge difference in the 14 that you put in the tournament overall.
They got some great coaches and more to come. By the way, Dusty Lear sent this to us on Twitter. SEC Big 10 had 50% of the final 32, now have 70% of the Sweet 16. They're getting $2 million per unit. That means if you advance, you get, as a conference, $2 million. So if you have 7 teams that advance over the weekend, that's $14 million. And again, you take all of whatever you gain in 1 year, add it up, and then you distribute it over a 6-year period of time. Nice side hustle for these guys to squeeze some more cash. Have a good show today. So everybody that has a team into the Sweet 16 got another $2 million per win over the weekend. So, Dusty, thank you for reaching out to us. Now, Kevin Gull made this comment. He goes, yeah, the SEC has 7 teams. The Big 12, with 4 of their 7, actually had the highest percentage of those who got in the tournament, but the Big 10, SEC, and Big 12 all with 50% of more of what they had to get into the field of 68. OptaStats had this note. First time the Sweet 16 is composed entirely of major conference teams. Craig brought this up earlier. Since the Sweet 16 officially began in 1975, the 4 conferences represented. Others, Sweet 16 had at least 7 conferences into the Sweet 16 in the years past since they began using that term and since it became a thing in the tournament, and that was 50 years ago. That says quite a bit, too.
Yeah, and look, to show you how much Cinderella is struggling, I'm not sure if you guys mentioned this while I was over there fixing our little network issue that we had, but the 10 seed is the double digits, the saddest double-digit seed ever, and it's bought and paid for. Because it's Arkansas and John Calipari and the amount they're spending on that roster. A 10 seed is actually underachieving for what Arkansas paid for. They didn't pay for a 10 seed roster. Now they paid for a Sweet 16 roster, but as far as everything that happened until this last weekend was a little underachieving for what Arkansas went out and bought last year.
First year maybe. First year, perhaps a little bit of growing pains. But, yeah, for what they're paying him,
for what they're paying him, they didn't pay him to be a 10 seed. Bottom line.
They didn't pay him to be a 10 seed. They did pay him to be a Sweet 16 guy.
Yeah, but he, again, this weekend is when he lived up to that. Until then, he had not yet. Like the roster was underachieving.
They weren't very good with Musselman's last year, were they?
They weren't. Yeah, and they weren't. They were up and down all year this year. So getting the Sweet 16, yeah, they've hit their stride. But again, when they did that, I'm sure they were a little bit like, hey, let's speed this up here because that's why
It's a huge win for him against Patino, his buddy, so to speak.
Buddy.
Yeah.
They don't.
So 2 years ago, by the way, in the Sweet 16, they had 9 different conferences. I mentioned that there's been 9 different conferences were a part of the Sweet 16 just a couple of years ago. That came from Stuart Mandel.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stats being thrown around. I saw John Fanta, this from Fox Sports, 64-team format since 1985. There's never been a Sweet 16 to not have at least one non-major conference team. So basically my entire life, that has never happened, and the closest instance was 2016 and 2017 when 15 major conferences made it, or major conference teams, and Gonzaga was the lone exception in both of those years. So it happened because Gonzaga made it happen, but it almost didn't because they were the only team to do it. But since 1985, there's never been a Sweet 16 to not see at least one non-major conference team, and that's now broken. So that's not the case now. It's ACC, barely. It's Big 12, it's Big 10, it's SEC. That's it. So this is definitely a different tournament. I'll say what I said at the beginning again. I'm not saying this is the way it's going to be, or I'm not predicting that. I have no earthly idea of what the future holds, but it does play well into the storyline of college sports right now and sort of the paranoia and the wonder about what this all looks like with the money going how it's going. This is very interesting timing for it to be the first time since 1985 that that's happened, and it's all the major conferences sitting here. So we'll see if that holds in years to come. But that is, I think, the most interesting thing. What has been a very uninteresting tournament, and as we started off talking about at the start of the show, in a lot of ways, I've still been entertained. I've still enjoyed a lot of the games. But, yeah, the mid-major or the major level dominance, even though some of those teams like in Arkansas might be a team that's technically an upset Cinderella-style team because of their seeding. Yeah, there's been a lot of just the higher teams moving on, and that's led to a kind of a quiet, I think, tournament here these first couple weekends.
Christopher Swirzewski, I think, and I hope I said that right. I'm sure I didn't, but if you think about it, he mentioned BYU had been a mid-major.
Right.
Houston was a part of the AAC. Arizona was part of the Pac-12, so that would have been a part of another, but that would have been a different conference. That you're right, that would have gotten into the Sweet 16. So thank you very much for that, and also so far already going at it today with some information to us and back to you inside the chat.
Yeah, there's 2 reasons as we talked about. I think it's obvious that there's 2 reasons. If and again, if this next year it's like half the field's mid-majors, then this will be a stupid talking point that lasted for only a year. But if it's like this again next year, then you go, wait a second, is this a pattern starting? And yeah, it's the combination of conferences. I mean, Oregon's representing the Big 10 last night, right? Mm-hmm. Arizona's representing the Big 12. BYU's representing the Big 12. And I know the Arizona, Oregon aren't mid-majors, but yeah, just that movement has consolidated, even though I swear I saw some last week. There's no consolidation. There absolutely is consolidation. Look at the tournament. Yeah. But there's that consolidation, and then the NIL money. I think that undoubtedly plays into the focus of Greg Sankey in particular to get his league in better order as far as basketball goes, and a lot of that was accomplished by many of the hires they made. And now another one that's been made in the last 24 hours that they hope contributes to that even more. With Texas, but yeah, those 2 combinations, or that combination of those 2 factors, are definitely big reasons as to why I think we're seeing it this year.
We're going to get to some coaching changes in just a second. Real quick, Paul. Nicole Arbach, 2 non-NIL factors. The conference realignment we just mentioned, BYU, Houston, etc. Veteran, former mid-major players finishing their careers at power conferences.
Yeah, transfer portal needs to be mentioned as well, of course. And I don't know why we went this far without not mentioning it. But, yeah, that's obviously a part of it as well.
But I also don't think, like she says, non-NIL factor, I don't think transfer portal and NIL can be
extracted especially in basketball. Those guys aren't leaving mid-majors to go to Arizona for nothing.
Yeah, the guy from Maryland made that clear yesterday.
Yeah, absolutely.
Derek Queen.
Did he travel?
Man, I don't like getting into that stuff. I don't think
But-
so.
okay, no,
On
no.
the winning shot.
Here's
on the game-winning shot.
Here's the thing.
No.
Okay, here's the thing. We don't know if he did or didn't. So now traveling is the new targeting.
Because we don't know quite how
We don't know what it is.
Yeah.
I wonder if any of that is morphed in from what the NBA is when you see LeBron
sure.
standing at midcourt and he just starts walking.
I'm sure.
Well, I mean, guys, the travel hasn't been called regularly
Yeah.
for like 30
Yeah.
years now. I mean,
Yeah.
it's the most non-called regular call that you could make, because if you called it actually the way it was, there would never be a game that finishes.
It'd be 27-24.
Yeah, so I mean, it is open to interpretation. I think it's got to be extra egregious, and even then, I've seen plenty of times in the NBA where it's so bad, I think even the referees are shocked that they don't even call it. They're like, they're too stunned to even call it. But yeah, I mean, that's one of those that's like targeting in that way of, do you call it in this moment? And it's like, well, you're supposed to, and what's your definition of it and all of that? I can see where that comes from.
And look, I think there will be the mid-major teams. I think what you're going to see is like, okay, Creighton, not even, that's a Big East team, but you'll see some teams that their NIL is just dedicated to that. Like Gonzaga is for basketball, where they'll be like, look, this is all our chips in the middle of the table for basketball because they don't have football, or it's just the biggest thing there. But I think that maybe some of the randoms, like the St. Peters of the world, are going to be tougher to see. I
George
think that'll be
Mason.
the George Masons, that'll be tougher to see.
Florida Atlantic even last year.
And again, if these SOBs put 76 teams in, it's going to whittle out more of the Cinderellas early on anyway, just because of matchups.
Yeah, I mean, it will, but I mean, I want to say something that's kind of controversial here. I understand kind of the wringing of hands over, the lack of Cinderella. That certainly is mostly why we are just a buzz on Mondays after tournament weekend's over, is because there's been a couple of games, if not more, that have had us just going nuts for 24, 48 hours, and the results are just crazy and this and that. But, I mean, for the lack of that, are y'all looking at the games we got in store?
Yeah.
Oh,
You
yeah.
looking at how big those
Hell yeah.
I mean, I don't go by, my fandom doesn't go by TV ratings of like, that wasn't a good game because 3 million people didn't watch it. Like, I'm not into that whole bag of corner of fandom, but there will be monster ratings for a lot of these games because there are massive fan bases involved, and there are fan bases like Kentucky involved, and there are fan bases that are new to it that are involved, that are excited, but they're big fan bases, and they're the Power 4 conferences, so they've got the most money involved, and they've got the biggest schools involved. And so for as much as people are like biting their fingernails over, is this the end of the Cinderella story as we knew it? Is this the way the tournament's going to be from here on out? I guarantee you may not like it, but the TV executives are beaming this morning. They are thrilled with the field that they've got remaining. I think pure basketball folks are thrilled with the matchups they've got in the Sweet 16. So there's going to be some mega games coming up that, yeah, it might not be Cinderella the way that we've been accustomed to after the first couple of weekends, but I think you're looking at the next couple of weekends and going, there's going to be some damn good basketball games coming up.
No matter who wins.
Yeah, no matter who wins.